Israel versus Palestine. That's the topic we're going to be discussing today. It's timely based on what is going on right now in the Middle East, and we want to be educated from a biblical perspective and historical perspective on what is really going on with the conflict right now in the Middle East. What is the history behind the war between Israel and Palestine? So grab your Bible because we're going to be using it. Grab a notepad so you can take some notes today. This is our Bible study here at Influence Church. If you're joining for the first time, why not hit that share button, hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any of our previous studies. We're going to jump straight into today's session now. It is going to be a lot of data coming at you, a lot of history we're going to cover. I know for a lot of folks, history is a difficult thing to sit through. I understand. I love history. However, it is difficult to read through and listen through all that has happened before. But I always tell people, if you don't understand where you've come from, it will be difficult to understand where you are going, especially when it comes to history, because history has a way of repeating itself. And the most uninformed you can sound right now is to not know history, right? By just judging what is going on in our world based on the current aspects and current world issues would be quite foolish. So let's look at the historical data, right? And like I said, this topic today is Israel versus Palestine. So we're going to be starting from way back, right? Because most of the discussions right now speak about over the last 1,000 years or the last 100 years, what has been going on versus Israel and Palestine. But we're going to go way back to roughly about 3,000 years ago, right? To find out what has been the root, where has this journey come from. And when you hear the name Palestine, you're probably not too sure what the name Palestine means, and we're going to discuss that as well today, right? And as well the name Israel, if you're not sure what the name Israel means, right? So the name Israel was given to Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham. So Abraham had his son Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob, right? And Jacob was given this name by an angel of the Lord. He was renamed as a blessing from God. He was renamed to Israel, which became the name that the nation of Israel adopted. And that's actually where we're going to be starting right now with Jacob, right? So Jacob, out of his descendants came 12 tribes of Israel, and then from there they developed into a nation. They eventually ended up in slavery under Egypt. And after leaving Egypt, this is known as the Great Exodus. If you've heard about Moses, you know about the Moses going to the Pharaoh of Egypt saying, "Let my people go." And this nation of Israel now left Egypt. Now they were under oppression in Egypt. They left Egypt and they had to go now to a space, a land. Now the land that they were heading towards was not just an arbitrary land. You see, God had promised a land to Abraham, again, the grandfather of Jacob, right? The father of this nation, the great father of this nation. He had promised a land to him known as Canaan. Now, when Israel left Egypt, they headed towards Canaan. And this is where we pick up the historical background of the nation of Israel. And yes, we are looking at the Bible and at history today because the Bible is historical data, right? So we're looking at the book of Joshua, and the book of Joshua accounts the Israelites now coming to the land of Canaan and conquering the land of Canaan. Now, when they did reach the land of Canaan, guess who they saw inhabiting the land of Canaan? The Palestinians, that's right. No. The Palestinians were not around, all right? They didn't exist. When they came to the land of Canaan, it was actually the Canaanites that lived there, right? Canaanites, right? People who live in Canaan were Canaanites. Now, the Canaanites, interestingly enough, were also relatives to the Israelites, right? Canaanites were from Canaan, who was the son of Ham, the grandson of Noah, right? So after the great flood, Noah and his descendants are all that inhabited the earth. Now, Ham, out of his descendants came the Canaanites. Out of Shem came the descendants of the Israelites. So they were actually relatives in that sense, right? Now, Israel do go into the land of Canaan. They conquer the land of Canaan. The Canaanites are separated from that land. Some did remain in the land of Israel. And over time, historically, the Canaanites kind of disappeared from the face of the earth. All historical records of them would actually describe them to be a vicious group of people. If you actually Google the word Canaan, it would actually say a hot-tempered individual in society. Not to be disrespectful, but they were more that type of clan. They were that type of clan that more were aggressive on that side, and along history they were just wiped out completely, not actually by Israel. They were wiped out by another nation that was conquering the known land back in that space of time in history, right? So Canaanites no longer actually exist. Some of their culture and relics do remain evident in modern day history, are preserved. So this was 1406 to 1220 BC, right? So this is BC is before Christ. So that's roughly about 3,000 years ago. We're in 2080 now, right? So roughly around 3,000 years ago, that's when Israel started occupying the land of Canaan. Now, they became a monarchy, actual nation with a king ruling over them in roughly 1000 BC. First king to be King Saul, who established Israel as a monarchy. And after King Saul, we had David. And then after David, we had Solomon. Solomon actually built the first temple in Israel that was designed based on God's guidance to the people of Israel on what the temple should look like. This temple would then be destroyed and it would then be rebuilt again, right? Which takes us to 931 BC, where the kingdom of Israel is actually divided. It's divided into two, into Israel and Judah, and it's actually separated and ruled by two separate kings. Jerusalem is the capital of Judea, and then Israel, its capital was Shechem, right? And from there now, they were a divided kingdom. Israel eventually fell, and Judah remained for a little while, but eventually Judah fell as well. And all of the land was conquered by, guess who? The Roman Empire, which brings us up to speed with Jesus' time, which is something we might be a little bit more familiar with. So when Jesus was upon the face of the earth, the Roman Empire had rulership over the entire landmass that used to be Israel, eventually became two kingdoms, southern and northern kingdom, and then now the entire thing was ruled under the Roman Empire. Under the Roman Empire, here's where things get a little bit interesting. Under the Roman Empire, the land was actually renamed Palestine. So the Roman Empire conquered most of the Western civilization, Eastern civilization at that time. When they conquered the land of Israel, they decided to rename the land of Israel. Now, there are two reasons why they may have renamed it to Palestine. The most prevalent reason is that because they wanted to wipe out the Israelites' remembrance of the land and they wanted to separate them from having ownership over the land because now the Roman Empire was ruling over it, they renamed the land to Palestine in acknowledgement of Israel's most ancient enemy known as the Philistines, right? You know about the Philistines, David and Goliath, right? The Philistines was one of Israel's greatest enemies. They would have occupied roughly around that space where the Gaza Strip is right now. They would have occupied around that space. Now, again, the Philistines, they no longer exist in modern day history. They were eventually wiped out of history completely. But the Roman Empire at this time, intentionally, based on assumptions from historical data, would have renamed Israel to Palestine because of the Philistines. Now, the other possible reason that is given for the renaming of the land to Palestine is because the Roman Empire would have used their language now because there was cultural assimilation and all the Jews had to learn Greek, right? And in that aspect of cultural assimilation, they would have renamed the land of Israel to the Greek translation to the word Israel. So Israel comes from the name that Jacob would have gotten where he wrestled with God, and it means to wrestle with God. Now, the word to wrestle with God, when translated into Greek, forms a word that sounds similar to Palestine. So there's two possible reasons. Historically, there's no real clarity on how it got renamed to Palestine, but at this point in history now, the name of the land was renamed to Palestine. So that's kind of interesting because Jesus would have actually lived in that area that was called Palestine by the Roman Empire, right? So this is where now Jesus would have walked the face of the earth after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We had the birth of Christianity, which exploded in the eastern part of our world. And then eventually now in 70 AD, the second temple that was built, so the temple was destroyed before, it was rebuilt, and then it was destroyed again in 70 AD, which is part of prophecy, because Jesus would have prophesied in Matthew that after he ascended into heaven, that the temple would be destroyed and that the Jews would be scattered throughout the earth. And this is what happened at the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. There was a lot of revolt between the Jews and the Roman Empire. It led to the Roman Empire actually slaughtering a lot of Jews, destroying the temple. A lot of Jews kind of separated throughout all parts of the earth, and some of them did remain in Palestine for that period in history, right? So after the Roman Empire came the Arab conquest, right? And this is where Islam was booted. So Islam was birthed roughly around 600 AD. Just in case you didn't know, it's not an ancient religion. It started at 600 AD. It's actually one of the more recent religions to exist, right? So 600 years after Jesus Christ, then Muhammad comes on the scene, and Muhammad is a military leader by all means. Don't get persuaded. He's not a prophet or religious leader. That might sound a little bit heretical to some groups. But he was a military leader, and this is where now the Arab conquest came, and they captured majority of the area that Rome used to rule over. And they spread Islam throughout those areas. And this is where now Palestine came under the rule of the Arabs, right? The Islamic law. And on the area where the Jewish temple used to exist, the Islamic rulers actually, well, Muhammad actually rebuilt or built the Dome of the Rock Mosque in that same exact spot. So up until today, the Dome of the Rock Mosque exists on the space that the temple in Jerusalem used to be in, the temple that Solomon would have built, and then it would have been destroyed and been rebuilt. But that temple that would have represented where God's presence would dwell actually is replaced by the Dome of the Rock Mosque right now, right? So that's 636 AD. What happens after that? Well, in 1517, so that's a big gap, right? So roughly around 1,000 years later, the Ottoman Empire came into power over all that same area that existed and included Palestine, right? Now, the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic super army at that point in history as well, right? And they would have conquered all the area that you're seeing in the red, the darkish reddish color. So here we would have had Palestine under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. Under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, during this time in history now, there was a mixture of different religious groups living in Palestine. So I want you to understand this now, right? Palestine was not an Islamic state. It was ruled over the Ottoman Empire, and it was ruled by Islamic law, but it consisted of different groups of people. So remember, after Jesus, Christianity was birthed. So there were Christians in Palestine. Then there was the fall of Jerusalem, and most of the Jews left, but some of the Jews remained. And then under Muhammad in 636 AD, there would have been the Arabs moving into Palestine. So there were actually Jews, Christians, and Muslims that lived in Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. And from there, from roughly around 636 AD to 1500s, and then moving forward, even until now, Palestine consisted of three major monotheistic religions, right? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? So after 1917, came the Zionist movement in 1900. Now, the Zionist movement did not come and overtake Palestine or anything like that compared to the other things that we saw in history, right? The Zionist movement was a movement that started in Europe, where most Jews decided that they wanted to go back to the Holy Land, because remember, they were separated throughout all of the world. They decided they wanted to move back to the Holy Land, which at this time is Palestine. It's ruled under the Ottoman Empire. It's ruled under Islamic law. It consists of different groups of people, right? It's a mixture of different people, like we said, Arabs, Jews, and Christians. But they decide now they want to move back to the Holy Land, which is what God had promised to them. And at this time now, they start making decisions to try to get things in place to move back to Israel, right? At this point in time, it's not Israel, it's just Palestine, right? Now, with this movement, a lot of the Jews that lived in Europe actually started moving back, and what they did was they purchased land from Arabs in Palestine, and they actually started back settling tens of thousands of Jews. They had done well for themselves in different parts of the world, and some of the major wealthy Israelites or Jews decided the Zionist movement is that Jews were to occupy the land of Israel, right? Jews specifically. So the Jews now purchased land from Arabs, and they started occupying that land in Palestine. So they started making grounds, headways now by their people moving back, the Jewish people moving back to Palestine. So this was 1900s. Then came the British rule. Now remember, the Ottoman Empire was still ruling at the time of the Zionist movement that started, right? While the Zionist movement is going on, Jews are trying to move back to Palestine, the British come into rule, right? And World War I actually led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the British rule over Palestine, right? So just as in the Caribbean, Britain would have ruled over Trinidad and Tobago. The same way, they would have been ruling over Palestine. Palestine would have been one of their colonies at this point in history, right? And then from 1918, they continued ruling over Palestine. And then there was the Great Holocaust in 1942, where about 6 million Jews were murdered by Hitler, right? During the Holocaust, a lot of the Jews that survived moved back now to Israel. So now Israel has a little bit more Jews than they used to have, right? There are more Jews there now. There's still Arabs and there's still Christians that is living in Palestine. Now, under the British rule, the British eventually gave the control over Palestine to the UN, right? The United Nations. Again, this was just how the British Empire kind of evolved over time into the United Nations. Under the United Nations in 1947, the United Nations proposed that Israel and Palestine would be a two-state place where they would both exist in that area of Palestine. So what happened is the British actually promised the Jews that they would give them back the land in Palestine, right? They made that promise to them during World War I, for the Jews to support in different ways during the World War, to give the British Empire that edge. Now, the British Empire was kind of loose with the land of Palestine. They were offering it to anybody. So they actually offered it to the Jews. They offered it as well to some of the Arabs as well. So they did offer it to different people. But eventually they said, okay, all right, we're going to try to give both the Israelites, both the Jews and both the Palestinians, we're going to give both of them the land, right? But their proposal was to give the Jews roughly around 55% of the land and the Palestinians roughly around 45% of the land, which the Palestinians rejected. And from there, things got really heated, and the UN decided, Britain decided they're going to pull out, and they're not going to have any kind of rulership anymore over Palestine. And a lot of their colonies, they kind of moved out of their colonies during that time in history, right? So they moved out completely, and at this point in history now, 1948, is where Israel declared itself a state. So at that point, when the British moved out, there was no governance anymore over Palestine, right? Because Palestine and Israel they were not states. They were just Jews living there, Arabs living there, and Christians living there. They were just living there in Palestine, but they were under the British rule. When the British moved out now, there was opportunity for someone to become an independent nation, right? Just as Trinidad and Tobago, when the British moved out, we became an independent nation. Israel now made that step and declared itself a state, right? An independent nation. And when that happened, war broke out. That's when the war really started between the Palestinians and the Israelites. And from that point in history till now is where we've had different types of war that occurred. Now, when that war broke out in 1948, it led to a 6-day war in 1967, right? So it led up to a major war in 1967, which lasted 6 days. This war, it was Israel versus Jordan and Syria and Egypt. At the end of this war, however, Israel ended up victorious, and they gained control over the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was eventually returned to Egypt in 1967, right? So here you can see a map, right? And you would see that this area here, that is kind of in that white spot, is where now Israel would have had control over. And then in 1964, the Palestine a Palestine group formed, and they tried to now fight in a more organized way against Israel to keep certain parts of the land, right? So this war that broke out in 1967 eventually led to the development of this Palestine group called the PLO, and they initially started attacking Israel from right around the spaces that Israel were occupying, trying to regain some territory in Palestine. Now, Palestine at this point was separated into a part of it, Gaza, the West Bank, was occupied by Palestine, and then the rest of it was occupied by Israel, right? Much as it is today, but the borders were a little bit bigger than it is right now, right? Eventually, this war led to a lot of death, and eventually the Palestinians, the PLO, the leader of the PLO, and the Israelites decided, okay, well, the leader of Israel decided, okay, we need to talk some peace treaties, get something in place. And they came to an agreement called the Oslo Accords in 1987. Now, in this accord, it's kind of messy, right? But this accord is what you see on the screen right now, where it is confusing, but basically in the same area of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, all the green Israel had control over, right? Now, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they kind of split up parts of it inside that piece, right? So the pieces that are red areas, the pieces that were under full Palestine control. The greenish colored areas were areas that were Palestine and Israel control, and the white areas were negotiable, right? So they were just up in the air, open to discussion, right? And this is when now, over time, from that time, 1987, Israel started taking more and more space in that white area, right? And eventually, Israel actually withdrew from Gaza and they put a wall around the Western Bank. So we would have seen here in this space here, this territory that is red was mostly fully controlled by Palestine. So Israel would have left it to Palestine, and then the white area that was still open, they end up building a wall around a certain parts of the West Bank as security, because of the ongoing conflict that kept happening between the PLO, between Palestinians and Israelites. They built it as protection. However, the Palestine saw it as them trying to take more territory, because some parts of the wall that they would have built would have been in that white area where Jews would have actually owned land there, but it would have been seen as the Jews actually trying to take more land away from the Palestinians. This eventually led to our modern day chaos, right? This led to, in 2007, the rise of Hamas. Now, Hamas is a terrorist group that arose in Palestine and took governance over Gaza. Now, the means to how they took governance over Gaza is really something that in the Western world we can't really comment on too much, right? Maybe they were elected, maybe it was not an election, but the fact is that they took power over Gaza and they became the governing body over Gaza, right? And from there now, Israel kind of blocked off Gaza for protection against Hamas. And from 2014, Hamas governed over Gaza till where we are now today, right? So from 2014 until now, there was this ongoing battle between Hamas and Israel. Now, how do we kind of conclude this thing? It's a really touchy topic, and as you saw historically, the land was initially for the Canaanites, occupy the land. Then the Israelites, it was promised to the Israelites by God, and they would have taken the land. And then for more than 1,000 years, they would have had that land in Palestine, which would have been Israel at that time. They would have ruled over that land. Eventually, the Roman Empire took over and renamed the land. Now, when we speak about from Bible prophecy, it's truly amazing that Israel even exists today, because after the Roman Empire renamed the area to Palestine, and from there, it was no longer Israel. Israel didn't exist as a nation anymore. And they didn't exist as a nation for um, roughly around 1900 years. It didn't exist at all as a nation. And then all of a sudden, somehow, this Jews started coming back. There was the Holocaust, and even more Jews returned to Jerusalem. And somehow, during that time, the Jews actually were able to become a nation once more. That is really phenomenal. It is certainly something that is miraculous, that a nation that just didn't exist for thousands of years would just come back into power, not through any big military reign that was conquering the known world, because that's how most nations came into power, the Roman Empire, etc. They were just conquering the known world. But Israel, they just started coming back into the land, and over time they occupied the space, they purchased land. There would have been some gruesome ways as well in which they would have taken more space in the land of Israel or Palestine at that time, right? Because there was war internally there where they would have taken back majority of the land. But them coming back is really amazing. Now, from a Bible's point of view, it is prophetic, because the Bible gives prophecy of the land of Israel being destroyed, which it was in 70 AD, but then being reformed again into a nation, which it is now. And after being reformed into a nation, there it leads into the end time prophecies of the Gog and Magog and the surrounding nations coming up against Israel and a big war breaking out, and then the rise of the Antichrist, etc., etc. Right? So from a biblical perspective, it is things that has to happen. The ways in which it would have happened, there is no justification for that in terms of the many civilian lives that would have died on both sides, both Palestinian and Israelites, over the many years of war continuously over and over and over. A few things we need to understand now that we kind of have a historical understanding of this entire thing, right? This entire Israel versus Palestine. Firstly, we need to understand that Hamas is a terrorist group that has established itself in Gaza. It is not a representation of the people that live in Palestine, right? This is important because when in our mainstream media right now, it kind of paints the picture of Islam versus Judaism, right? But it is not a case of one religion versus the other. It's not a case of Muslims versus Jews with Judaism, right? That's not the case actually, because Palestine is occupied by Muslims, Christians, and Jews right now, right? So the Gaza Strip right now is occupied by all these different groups of people. Now, Hamas is an Islamic, radical Islamic group that has been attacking Israel, and they would have made a significant move a couple of weeks ago and slaughtering a lot of innocent lives, Jewish people in Israel as an act of terror. Israel has responded, and now that they have responded, we see that a lot of lives are being lost, a lot of casualties. Now, according to Israel, their aim is to defend themselves by eradicating Hamas, the terrorist group. It's not the first time that Israel would have had to eradicate terrorist groups that rise up to try to kill the Jews that are in that space, because for Hamas, they want to regain the entire area. They're not looking to find peace. They are looking to regain the entire area that once was Palestine, right? So they're looking to regain all of Israel, right now, current world Israel. Now, on the side of Israel, however, Israel is in that space where they're trying to protect their citizens. Israel already has control over the Gaza Strip, the Western Bank, and all of Israel, right? They already have control over it from a point of view of governance, right? Because the Islamic State of Palestine does not exist. There's just an Islamic terrorist group, Hamas, that is trying to run that space on the Gaza Strip and then take more territory. Now, Islamic nations have made clear statements over and over, especially Islamic nations that are run by Islamic law, right? Islamic law in the eastern part of our world is much different from Islam in the Western culture, but they've made statements over and over that they don't see or recognize Israel to be a nation, and they want to see Israel completely eradicated from the face of the earth, right? And again, Hamas is this group stands for this same move of trying to just eradicate all of the Jewish people that exist. Now, even in Jerusalem, they are not just only Jews, right? In Israel, they are not just only Jews, there are Muslims and there are Christians that live in Jerusalem, right? Now, but something else to understand on the other half of it. So while, yes, Hamas is a terrorist group, the current president of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, he is more of a conservative type of Jew, which means, by him being conservative, it means that he does see Arabs and Christians as well as second-class citizens, right? So he's pro-Jews, right? And that means there is this sense of where he will not value to a certain level the other people that exist in Israel. So right now in Israel, Arabs and Christians are treated as second-class citizens. There is that form of racism that exists. Now, that aspect is something that has to be internally sorted out, right? But when it comes to the war that exists right now, it is clear that Hamas is a terrorist group, and what is happening right now has to come to an end. Now, I don't have the solution, obviously, and it's a very tricky topic to even make any kind of conclusions on, right? But I want you to understand that it's not a religious war, because we keep hearing in the Western civilization, free Palestine, and it's painted as a religious war, like the Muslims are being suppressed and they're being oppressed and they're being murdered. But it's not a religious war, it's a war for territory. Hamas is using Islamic rule because they are a radical Islamic group, and they are using that to as what perpetuates them forward in Gaza. But the has always been over land, right? The war that existed with Israel versus Palestine has always been over the land space. Currently, what is going on is a terrorist group has risen up over the last 15 years. We could debate about what is the cause and effect and who's responsible, and Israel could be part of the reason why they've raised up and all these different things. But the fact is that they are a terrorist group right now, and they are killing innocent civilians. And on the flip side now, because of their actions, because of the war that has broken out, more civilians are dying on both sides, both Palestinians and both Israelites, right? Palestinians are not Muslims. The area, people that are known as Palestinians are people that live in Palestine, right? Now, as I showed you, historically, Palestine used to be the entire area after the Roman Empire. Before that, it was Israel, then it became Palestine, and now it is mostly Israel that occupies that land space. So, what should be your stance now as a Christian? Well, for me, I'm not the person that is over that I'm not the person that is in that space that pushes heavily this aspect of Israel is God's chosen people, pray for them, they are right in everything that they do, and everybody else is against them, right? Now, there are certain biblical prophecies that has to be fulfilled that surrounds Israel. The fact is, though, that Israelites, mainly the Jews, right? The Jews did reject Jesus Christ. They did reject Jesus Christ, and we do have to pray for them to come to know Jesus Christ. But at the same time, we must understand that while they are God's chosen people, they have rejected God, and they have to turn back to God as well. They are not righteous and holy in that sense of what is going on right now, right? They are doing things as well that is not pleasing unto God as Christians, and we need to have that perspective, right? We need to also put ourselves in that space of knowing that what is going on in the eastern part of in the Middle East is much different from our perspective here in Western civilization. The way that they think, the mentalities are a lot different. Even the governance is different, right? So Israel is the only state in the Middle East that is not under dictatorship. All the other states that surround Israel are under dictatorships, and the majority of the dictatorships that surround Israel want to just see Israel annihilated completely, right? They just want to see the Jews annihilated completely. Now, the Jews have this mentality because of the Holocaust that they will never back down again. They don't ever want a repeat of what happened under the rule of Hitler, where 6 million Jews were murdered. So there's this psyche that goes on as well between the Jews and those that are Arabs, right? However, I want you to understand when we talk about Palestine, Palestine is not Muslims or Arabs. And when we talk about Israel, Israel is neither Jews, right? Israel contains the mixture of all those different dynamics, all these different groups of people. Just as in our nation of Trinidad and Tobago, there are different cultural backgrounds and different religious backgrounds. It's the same thing when it comes to that diversity in Israel. So for us now in the Western civilization to kind of paint it or think through the lens of Jews versus Muslims, or I don't even know how Christians get into the dance, right? We are not involved in this at all when it comes to Christians versus Muslims, right? Christians are the minority in both Palestine and Israel, right? So the point is, when it comes to biblical prophecy, certain things has to happen. Right now, the Dome of the Rock must exist on the land the space that the temple in Jerusalem used to be on. And as we know from biblical prophecy, the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt, right? Now, Jerusalem does belong right now to Israel, but certain things would have to happen for that space that currently is occupied by the Dome of the Mosque to become a space now where Israel could demolish that and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, what has to happen politically? I can't really answer that. But the fact is that some significant changes will have to happen in how the current setup is in Israel between Israel and Palestine, right? So that being said, the main takeaways is to pray for Israel and Palestine. Pray for that they come to this space where there's peace, where terrorism is eradicated, but at the same time there isn't any big drive towards oppression of any group of people, like those that are Palestinians. And there is this sense of where there can be security because everybody wants to live in a world that there is security. Thankfully, we are not part of that. We have not been birthed into that place where there is war going on in that part of the world. And thankfully, we are in a part of the world that is safe and secure. And even historically, when we look at history, we are in one of the most safest periods in history when it comes to war, right? But we still want to pray for those that are right now in that place where they are hurting, where people are dying, where they're in pain, when they're in fear. So pray for Israel and Palestine. Don't think that because you're a Christian, you have to pray for Israel and everybody that's against Israel must now die. Now, yes, Hamas, and that is a terrorist group, has to be put to an end somehow, right? And we do pray that that terrorism does come to an end, right? But let's just keep in prayer everyone that is suffering right now and is going through that pain and hurt of war and all the ramifications that comes from war. So that brings me to the end of this study. It was a very tricky one to cover, but I do hope that I would have shed some light on current day issues as well as historical information. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the comment section, or you can even contact me personally. I will be glad to respond to your questions and provide as much clarification as I can. If there are criticisms or correction, feel free as well to drop that in the comment section or reach out to me. Thank you so much for viewing today. If you have not done it as yet, hit that share button, hit that subscribe button. Until we see again, God bless you.